Greetings from Mesa View United Methodist Church of Albuquerque, New Mexico. We hope this message will be meaningful and relevant to your life and your relationship with God. We invite you to join us for worship on Sunday mornings. Our traditional service is at 8:30 a.m. and at 11 a.m. we gather for contemporary worship. More information may be found at our website, mesaviewumc.com. Now may you be blessed through the reading and hearing of God's holy word.
The Hebrew scripture reading comes from the first book of the Bible, Genesis, chapter 32, beginning at verse 22. And this can be found on page 28 of the Pew Bible. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And so he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." And then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
We are now 1 week into the Olympics with 1 week to go. Some of the things that were expected to happen at the Olympics have happened. Some of the things that were not expected to happen did happen. And some of the things that were expected to happen did not happen. Sort of like life. And so we continue looking at what the Olympics can teach us about our faith. And today we look at one of the oldest of sports, wrestling. Wrestling was one of the original sports found in both the Olympic Games and also in the Isthmian Games, which were the games that took place in the city of Corinth. But of course, wrestling as a sport is even older than that. It's said that wrestling has been found amongst every culture around the world. And it may be one of the oldest sports in which we as humans participate. Now, somehow, walking is an Olympic sport, and so we're going to have to say that walking is the oldest sport we participate in. But wrestling has to be pretty close to it. There is a Sumerian wall carving from around the year 3000 BCE, which depicts a wrestling match. And it appears to also picture a referee overseeing this match. There's another carving in the tomb of the Egyptian pharaoh Ptahhotep from around 2300 BCE, and it shows 6 different wrestling holds. Of those, 5 of them are still in use today. Wrestling has more importance, more than just as a game, though. It's said in the Shinto legend that the ownership of the Japanese islands came about based upon a wrestling match when the thunder god Taikai Mikazuchi defeated his rival in a wrestling match and claimed the Japanese islands for his own. Another Greek myth has Zeus and his fellow Olympian gods wrestling the Titan gods and overcoming them for possession of the universe, with Zeus defeating his own father in a wrestling match. So perhaps it should not be surprising then that we hear this passage that we just heard from Genesis of Jacob engaging in a wrestling match with this stranger whom we come to associate as being God. But also because of its prevalence in the world, we might also be surprised that wrestling is not referenced more, either as a theme or as an actual event, more in Scripture than it is. Because of all the places that wrestling is talked about, except for one of them, which is in the letter to the Colossians, in which we're told that Epaphras is wrestling in his prayers on behalf of the Colossians. Every other mention of wrestling involves the story of Jacob. Even at the beginning of Jacob's life, there is wrestling involved. We're told that he and his twin brother Esau struggle inside their mother's womb. They're wrestling with each other. And Rebekah is told that there are two nations at war amongst the two brothers here in her womb, and that the second, the younger born, will triumph over the firstborn. Esau is born first. He's named because of his red hair. And then Jacob comes out holding on to Esau's ankle. And because of that, he is given his name Jacob, which means something like usurper or grasper, giving indication of what he will eventually do in overcoming Esau. So his life begins in conflict. And then to make matters worse, we're told that Isaac, his father, prefers his brother Esau over him, and his mother Rebekah prefers him over his brother Esau. And so there's this struggle that takes place amongst the brothers right from the start. It is with the help of his mother that Jacob tricks his father Isaac into giving him the blessing that is due to the firstborn son. And he's already gotten Esau to turn over his birthright to Jacob because Esau is hungry. And so Jacob says, will you sell your birthright for a bowl of stew? No one ever accused Esau of being the sharpest knife in the drawer. But in stealing his brother's blessing from his father through this act of deception, Esau says that he is going to kill him. And so Jacob flees out into the wilderness. And there he has his first encounter with God, or a vision of the heaven we commonly refer to as Jacob's ladder. Jacob then finds his uncle Laban. He falls in love with his cousin Rachel, and he agrees to work for 7 years for his uncle in return for Rachel's hand in marriage. But on the day of the wedding, Laban tricks Jacob and substitutes Leah for Rachel, Leah being the older daughter. And when Jacob discovers this trickery has taken place after it's too late to do anything about it, Laban says to him, you know, you might do strange things in your land, but here we don't give things to the younger children that belong to the older ones. Sort of a backhanded slap to Jacob, reminding him of what he has done, why he's even there to start with. But Jacob then agrees to work another 7 years for Rachel's hand in marriage. And then he tricks Laban, taking his best flocks with him as they're leaving his land to go back to his home. But as he's making his way there, he hears that Esau, with all of his men, are making his way towards Jacob. Now, last thing Jacob knew was Esau wanted to kill him. Lots of years have gone by, but he's still not sure what Esau's intentions are anymore. So that's what leads up to that story that we just heard. And so he again sends his family across the river. He finds himself alone at night. And Jacob doesn't strike me as someone who's very good by himself. He's much more of a people person. He needs people around him to function properly. Because the only other time we're told that he is alone is when he has this first vision of God. And so he has this next encounter when he wrestles with a man for the entirety of the night. Now, when we typically think of wrestling, there's sort of two images that come into my mind. One is of high school wrestlers wearing 3 or 4 sweatsuits in overly heated rooms in order to lose lots of weight so they're ready for competition. Or it's of people bashing each other over the head with chairs and throwing each other out of rings and matches that are predetermined before they even step into the ring. I hate to ruin your fantasies about pro wrestling. It is this second image of wrestling that actually caused the U.S. Olympic wrestling team to be the only team without corporate sponsorship for a number of years. Because what people thought of when they thought of wrestling was the WWE, not what actually takes place. But there are 2 different styles of wrestling that are common, and there is a point to where I'm getting here. The first is known as freestyle wrestling, in which the wrestlers are able to use their legs aggressively and actively against their opponent. The only thing you can't really do is to lock their necks or their heads in your legs. The second style is known as Greco-Roman wrestling. This is the one we're much more familiar with. And in that one is just brute force, except you can't use your legs, nor can you touch your opponent anywhere below the belt line. Now, from what we hear of this wrestling match between Jacob and this unknown assailant, is it appears that they're doing Greco-Roman wrestling. And we say that because they make mention several times of him touching him on his hip and knocking his hip out of place. That perhaps there might be some cheating that's going on here, a violation of the rules. Don't freak out. I'm not saying that God is cheating in this wrestling match. But it's unusual that they mention this several times. And it could be that this is a preemptive act, knowing that Jacob, as the cheater, if he could do it himself, he would do exactly the same thing. But what is clear in this story is that God is not just toying with Jacob in this moment, that they are actually struggling together. That God is struggling with Jacob, and Jacob is struggling with God, and neither side will let go. Then as morning comes around, Jacob is told he needs to let go, and Jacob refuses. He says, always the bargainer, unless you give me a blessing, I'm not going to let go of you. And so this stranger says, what's your name? Now there's something significant taking place here, because when he says, what's your name, it should harken back to that story when he steals the blessing rightly due to Esau. Because he dresses up in Esau's clothing, and he covers himself in the smell of sheep, because Esau is a shepherd. And he goes into Isaac's room, his father's room, and his father has bad eyesight, and he can't tell which son it is, and he says, who are you? And Jacob lies. He says, I'm Esau, can't you tell? But this time, when God asks him, who are you? He doesn't lie. He says, I'm Jacob, the usurper, the grasper. He says who he is. He says, here I am. This is who I am. And then there's this demand of the blessing. He won't let go until God blesses him. Now, the second reason why this encounter is significant is because this seems to be the moment when Jacob actually finally accepts God as his own. In his interactions with his father, he always refers to God as your God. And then when he encounters this vision in the wilderness, what he says to God is, if you will do these things for me, if you'll protect me and give me what I want, then I'll bow down and worship you. It's a quid pro quo. It's not faith, that's an economic exercise. But there's a change that takes place in this encounter, in this wrestling with God. When Jacob, this God becomes Jacob's God, and indeed we'll refer to this God as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now this transition of accepting God comes, as often does in Scripture, with a change in name. And he will no longer be known as Jacob the usurper, but instead he will be called Israel. Now in Hebrew, Israel means God rules. But what we're told here is that the meaning of Israel comes meaning that he struggles with God and with man, and he overcomes. Israel is one who struggles with God. Later Jewish interpretation also says that it comes to mean one who is honest or straight with God, one who doesn't hide anything, one who's honest. So when Jacob is asked his name, who are you? He no longer lies. He says, I'm Jacob, the usurper. So I think it's critical for us in our faith lives to remember that Israel is not just a nation, it's not just a group of people, but to remember this about struggling and striving, about wrestling with God. This idea has a much longer and more storied tradition within Judaism than it does within Christianity. And we can see that in the role that most rabbis play, which is they're not just there to help people develop in their faith and to teach, but they poke and they prod and they question people. Do you believe that? Why do you believe that? What about this? What about this? What would happen if this happened? They're sort of struggling with their congregants. And they struggle together and they struggle with God. One rabbi said to me, we don't really have conversations with God, we have arguments with God. We've lost that to a large degree within Christianity, although we still find it in the New Testament. But we shouldn't be afraid to wrestle, to struggle, to strive with God. Because when we are afraid to do that, bad things can happen in our faith lives. We can get into trouble because while we might struggle with God during the good times, most of our true wrestling with God comes at the bad times. Those times in which our lives seem to be falling apart, in which the promises we thought had been made to us are broken, crumbling around our ears. And that's when we need to be able to say to God, I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. That's when we're wrestling with God. When we're asking questions and demanding answers, even if they're not forthcoming. Wrestling with our faith. To be Israel, to be open and honest about who we are and what we are experiencing and what we're feeling. But the most important part about wrestling matches is not to let go. If you let go, you lose. One of the things I see fairly often with people, especially those who have left the church or have left God behind, is it was some tragedy in your lives that made that happen. That they turned away from God, they let go. And I understand that response. Because we often think or we're told that when we become Christians, God will protect us. Nothing bad will ever happen to us. Or we're told in the midst of tragedy that everything happens for a reason. It's all part of God's plan, even if that's not scriptural. That's what we're told. Because it might make us feel better or tries to give some answer to things that are unanswerable. And we turn away. We let go of God because those things don't actually work for us. Now, after the shooting in Orlando, there were 4 episodes of All in the Family that were shown on a television station that I had never actually seen before. I thought I'd seen nearly all the All in the Family episodes. And in this one, Archie Bunker, who's a taxi driver, many of you might remember, has a woman pass out in the back of his cab and he saves her, giving her CPR and mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. But as it turns out, it's not a woman. It's a male actor dressed up as a woman. And you might imagine what Archie's response was. But over time, he and the family become friends with Beverly, which is his stage name. And then he and Michael, their son-in-law, are walking down the streets and they are attacked. And Beverly is beaten to death. And so the name of the episode is Edith Loses Her Faith. And Edith stops going to church, and she questions whether God even exists, or whether God cares. Because she wants answers of why this would happen to him, why he would be attacked and killed simply because of who he is. And so Michael, also affectionately known as Meathead, says to her, "Did you take algebra in school?" And Edith says, "Yeah, but I didn't understand it, so I dropped out." He said, "Yes, but you didn't drop out of school, did you? Maybe there's some things we just don't understand." There are just things that we just don't understand. But we don't leave God behind. We don't let go of the only thing that can give us the hope and the strength to be able to get through it. We keep struggling and we keep striving. We keep wrestling with God. And like Jacob, when we encounter God, when we truly wrestle and struggle in our faith, we will not go away unchanged. If you are not fundamentally different in your walk from where you started to where you are now, something is wrong. Hopefully you don't have a limp because of this wrestling. But you should be different. You should think different. You should act different. You should live differently because of your relationship, your striving and struggling with God. Someone recently told me they kept asking for a sign from God that what they were doing in their faith life was making a difference. God, give me a sign. And then they realized they were different. From where they had been to where they are now in this struggling and striving, they were different, a different person. That was God's sign. You've changed. There you are. In their wrestling, God had changed them. We are all descendants of Israel, descendants of the promise, the one whose name means struggles with God. So struggling with God is not a sign of weakness, but of strength. But we have to remember that in wrestling with God, we have to hold on. Don't let go until the end of the match when God says, "Well done, my good and faithful servants." But we also have to remember that God is struggling with us as well, and that God will never let go. God is not looking for people to be standing on the sideline cheering. He's looking for us to get out on the mat and engage. To engage in that struggle in our faith lives. And for those who are involved, those who are struggling, who wrestle with God, we will be changed by the encounter. I pray that it will be so, my brothers and sisters.